Today, we're continuing with the Bow of Ulysses. We're going to cover the political environment of the time in the Caribbean, and specifically the possibility of democracy, absolutist rule, or something in the middle. Democracy had become an unquestionable good at home in Britain, but many colonies of Britain, specifically the eastern ones, were governed with absolute authority. So for the Caribbean, there were a couple of possible ways forward. The situation can't really be understood, though, unless you're familiar with what had happened about 80 years earlier in Haiti. That event would seriously color any discussions about democracy in the Caribbean. Froude gives a pretty good summary, so I'm going to let him explain it. Quote, "When the French Revolution broke out, and liberty and the rights of man became the new gospel, slavery could not be allowed to continue in the French dominions. The blacks of the colony were emancipated and were received into the national brotherhood. In sympathy with the Jacobins of France, who burnt the chateaux of the nobles and guillotined the owners of them, the liberated slaves rose as soon as they were free and massacred the whole population, man, woman, and child. When Napoleon sent an army to reclaim Haiti for France, the yellow fever broke out among the French soldiers, and so they had to return. As you can imagine, Haiti didn't fare very well under black rule. They now sit at 214 out of 229 in terms of GDP per capita, just above North Korea, but largely surrounded by other countries ran by Africans. Many who follow neo-reaction want absolutist rule, whether that's monarchy or some sort of artificial intelligence-controlled government. Froude believed in absolutism in some situations, but not others. For instance, quote, "If you choose to take a race like the Irish or like the Negroes, whom you have forced into an unwilling subjection and have not treated when in that condition with perfect justice, if you take such a race, strike the fetters off them, and arm them at once with all the powers and privileges of loyal citizens, you ought not to be surprised if they attribute your concessions to fear, and if they turn again and rend you." And that's not an argument for absolutism on principle. It's an argument from practicality, really. If you've been occupying and controlling another people for hundreds of years, you shouldn't expect them to be friendly when you give them some power again. The quote continues, quote, "When we are brought into contact with races of men who are not strong enough or brave enough to defend their own independence, and whom our own safety cannot allow to fall under any other power, our right and our duty is to govern such races and to govern them well, or they will have a right in turn to cut our throats." This is again very practical. If there are weak nations out there who can't defend themselves against aggressors, and we can't afford to have those aggressors emerge victorious, then we have to go to war with those weak nations ourselves and occupy them. You saw this on a global scale during the Cold War, where two powerful forces were either occupying or had significant influence over the entire globe. And it was at least partially out of fear that if they didn't have influence, the other side would. Taking a step back from these abstract ideas, one of the cool parts of the Bow of Ulysses that we haven't really covered yet is that Froude was actually there in these islands when he was writing. The way he writes about these events makes the world feel so small and accessible. Here's an example. Quote, "On the first night of my arrival to Trinidad, before we went to bed, there came an invitation to me to attend a political meeting which was to be held in a few days on the Savannah. Trinidad is a purely crown colony, and has escaped hitherto the introduction of the election virus. The newspapers, and certain busy gentlemen in Port of Spain, had discovered that they were living under a degrading tyranny, and they demanded a constitution. They did not complain that their affairs had been ill-managed. On the contrary, they insisted that they were the most prosperous of the West Indian colonies, and alone had a surplus in their treasury. For myself, I could but reply to the gentleman who had sent the invitation, that I was greatly obliged by the compliment, but that I knew too little of their affairs to make my presence of any value to them. As they were doing so well, I did not see myself why they wanted an alteration. Political changes were generally little more than turns of a kaleidoscope. You got a new pattern, but it was made of the same pieces, and things went on much as before. It's funny how that works. Things are going well, the best in the region, but people get it into their heads that they're being ill-treated, and suddenly people demand change. I'll return to the kaleidoscope idea in a second, but the fact that it was newspapers calling for these changes caught my attention. Later on, he's covering Jamaica, and he's writing about the push for a Jamaican constitution. He writes, quote, "My own opinion as to the wisdom of such an experiment matters little, but I have a right to say that neither blacks nor whites have asked for it, that no one who knows anything of the West Indies and wishes them to remain English sincerely asked for it, that no one agitated for it save a few newspaper writers and mulattoes whom it would raise into consequence." So the media is drumming up popular resentment against the authorities. I guess some things never change, huh? A little later, Froude goes on a tirade attacking the prophets of democracy and equality. Quote, "Whosoever will be saved, before all things it is necessary that he hold the radical faith. And the radical faith is this: all men are equal, and the voice of one is as the voice of another, And whereas one man is wise and another foolish, and one is upright and another crooked, yet in this suffrage none is greater or less than another. The vote is equal, the dignity co-eternal. Truth is one and right is one, yet right is right because the majority so declared it, and justice is justice because the majority so declare it. And if the majority affirm one thing today, that is right, and the majority affirm the opposite tomorrow, that is right. Once the radical was a liberal and went for toleration and freedom of opinion. He has become a believer now. He is right and you are wrong. And if you do not agree with him, you are a fool and you are wicked besides. Doesn't that strike you like the classical liberal progressive difference? It's amazing that he was seeing this transition from liberal to progressive back in the 1880s. It makes you wonder whether there were any actual liberals at all, or if they were always just seizing the moral high ground of tolerance in order to get a better vantage point to persecute you from. Quote, "The chief characteristic of this age, as it was the chief characteristic of Plato's, is the struggle for what we call the rights of man. In other times, the thing insisted on was that men should do what was right as something due to a higher authority. Now the demand is for what is called their rights, as something due to themselves. And among these rights is a right to liberty, liberty meaning the utmost possible freedoms of every man consistent with the freedom of others, and the abolition of every kind of authority of one man over another. It is with this view that we have introduced popular suffrage, that we give everyone a vote, or aim at giving it, as the highest political perfection." This reminds me of Jordan Peterson's argument that we are focusing too much on rights and too little on responsibilities. No matter what you think of him, and I have my problems, any serious critique of classical liberalism has to include a skepticism of rights themselves. And so in that aspect, Jordan Peterson is much more radical than almost all of the alt-right is. But going back to the Caribbean, these colonies were not only pushing for democracy and for rights, they were also pushing for complete self-government. As you can imagine, Froude didn't believe in that either. Quote, "Self-government is a beautiful subject for oratorical declamation. If the fact corresponded to the theory, and if the possession of a vote produced the elevating effects upon the character, which are so noisily insisted upon, it would be the welcoming panacea for political and social disorder. Unfortunately, the fact does not correspond to the theory. The possession of a vote never improved the character of any human being and never will." Honestly, I would go further than that. It used to be that only the elites covered history, the classics, and government in school. They were the only ones you needed to teach because they were the only ones making the high-level decisions. Everyone else was concerned about their own lives and their own trades. They had other stuff they were worried about. Now everyone has to learn these things because we have this idea that everyone should be in charge of the government. But the level of education has been reduced by so much that the classics and philosophy you read are all translated excerpts. The history is all focused on the Holocaust and major wars, and only 36% of the US population can name all three branches of the government. And only a small percentage of the population will actually care about these ideas, or even ideas at all. And we should just accept that. I am glad that I found a few thousand of you who enjoy these videos. That's it for this one. In our next video, we're going to cover Froude's thoughts on race, and trust me, there were a lot of them.